Hello and welcome to Legal Thinking from RWK Goodman. I'm Liam Pape.
And I'm Ed Wotton.
In today's episode, we talk about split land and build matters and why you might want to do this. Who are our guests today, Ed?
Well, today we have our very own David Lane, who's a senior associate in our real estate team and helps business owners to acquire, dispose of and manage any interest in land. And also Sam Lamb from Savills in the Oxford development team, who specialises in new build sales in particular. So yeah, some perfect people to talk about this topic.
Indeed. So without any further ado, let's roll tape. So David, just to kick us off, could you give us an overview of who you are and who are the type of clients who you tend to work with?
Yeah, so I'm David Lane, Senior Associate Solicitor at RWK Goodman, and within our team we deal with commercial property matters and land development matters, and it's on the land development side that is the reason why we're here today.
Great. Okay, yeah, because you mentioned why we're here today. We're here today to talk about split land and build matters. What is that?
Okay, so this is a type of matter that we've started to see come to the fore a lot more recently, and it relates to new builds. And the traditional way of delivering new builds really has just been that someone will come in and view a property, and if they like it, then they'll go ahead and they'll purchase it, or it may be done off plan. And they might have an input into the finish of the property, but fundamentally, it's still done as a one-stage process where the buyer will just acquire the finished article at the end and move in. Whereas with custom house building, it takes place as a two-stage process, and within that, the first element is buying the land, which is normally as a bare plot, and then a separate agreement will be entered into with ordinarily the developer, and then once the purchaser owns the land, then the developer will set about building the house, and that's obviously quite a deviation from the traditional way of doing it. And there's a sort of spectrum of outcomes within that. So, for instance, over in Vista that people may have seen on the Grand Designs programme, there's some self-built houses over there, and that planning permission is granted such that people will come in and purchase the property and then just look to actually build the property themselves. So that's kind of one end of things. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you might purchase your plot of land, and then at the same time as you complete on that purchase, you will then actually enter into a build contract with the seller / developer. And as soon as you own it, then the developer will put in hand the build of the project, and they'll do that to your specification and design. And it's that end of the spectrum that we've been helping people out with mostly recently.
And I mean, you've touched a little bit upon it there, but could you just go into a little bit more detail about why people might want to do this? Sure.
So there's four reasons really that I was thinking of why people would do it. And firstly, from the developer's perspective, it's quite advantageous because when they're building houses, it obviously costs a lot of money, and you've got all the labour and all the materials, and that's all been fronted up by the developer, and they only get the money in right at the end of the process. So it's actually quite good to mitigate risk on their part if they're getting some money in, and approximately half of the total value of the house. Say, for instance, if it was going to be £1 million property, then the land might be sold as a bare plot for £500,000, and the build value itself might be the subsequent £500,000. So within this type of transaction, if it's set up as a split land and build matter, then the developer will be getting in half the value up front, and then as the build progresses and hits the key milestones, then they'll also be getting staged payments. So it actually mitigates risk in quite a big way for the developer. And then the second of the four reasons is from the purchaser's perspective, then they get an input into the build process. They can choose different aspects they want. By its very nature, a custom house build means that they'll be able to choose the layout and really deliver the home that they want to live in for the future. The third reason is a financial one. Again, this is linked to the purchaser. So if you take into account stamp duty, for instance, all these matters are different, and we would always advise the client to get their own independent advice on this front. But if they are acquiring, again, going back to my £1 million house example, the bare plot for £500,000, then they would only pay stamp duty on that sum rather than the full sum of the £1 million. So in that sense, it can be quite advantageous for the buyers. And also in terms of CIL, which is Community Infrastructure Levy, and that's a tax on developers whereby once they've got their planning permission, they have to make contributions which go to the local area. But with self-builds, there is an exemption. So if it goes through on that basis, then actually that can be waived. So the CIL payment wouldn't be due. And the last reason really is on the planning side of things, which is kind of a wider point. The local authorities, they under pressure really from government to increase custom house building, and each authority has a list where people can sign up and show their interest for undertaking a custom or a self-build. And in terms of the local authority approving planning permissions and approving schemes, then they're much more amenable to do that now, where there's going to be a custom or self-build element, because they're under obligations to meet those registrations. So if there are a lot of people in a particular area that want to undertake this kind of matter, then the local authority needs to try and deliver on that.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. I just wanted to maybe take it to a kind of hypothetical and talk about the process a bit in more detail. And I was wondering, David, if you could just perhaps start with an example scenario of when this kind of matter might come up.
Okay, sure. So we've got a client at the moment, and they've had a house presented to them, or an opportunity whereby at the moment it's just a bare plot of land, and the developer is in the process of looking to acquire it. And when they do, they will be passing on the land as a bare plot, and our client is going to be purchasing that as the first half of the transaction, and I'm helping with that. So we undertake the normal conveyancing due diligence aspects on that to make sure that the title to the property is okay, or to the land is fine, and that there's not going to be issues with the land itself, and it's got all the different rights and obligations. And once we're satisfied that it's going to be a plot where they can get good title to it, and it's actually going to be suitable for the development to take place, we would complete on that purchase. And whilst that's also going on the transactional side, our colleagues would be helping to sort out the build agreement, again with the seller / developer, and they'll be making sure that agreement's got all the right obligations on both of the different parties, and the right protections in there, obviously to mitigate any risk whilst the build is going on, because that's one of the potential issues that you don't want to see. If there's any stumbling blocks which arise during the build process, that there's the ability for the client to still be covered in that event. And when the build agreement is finalised, then we'd bring the two sides together, and we would simultaneously complete on the land purchase, and then that would mean that the client owns the land, and at that same moment would enter into the build agreement, and then that gives the seller the ability to then go ahead and actually start the build project, and then from then it's just a case of monitoring the build as it goes.
Thank you very much for that. And Sam, now I have some questions for you. When did you start to see custom build matters increase in frequency?
Well, over the past 2 years, I would say they were in the market prior to that, but a lot more commonplace now. And as David alluded to, I think that's born out of government policy and changes to individual planning policies across the county, and there are 4 or 5 within our remit, and they're slowly sort of creeping into all of their plans. And as a result, we're seeing the developers put in applications on sites that might otherwise perhaps be, perhaps planning might be difficult, and they're achieving that planning off the back of that. And we're also seeing it implemented on larger developments. So where there's a certain number of units, there'll be a requirement to provide a certain number of self-build plots. So yeah, lots more permissions being granted, and therefore much more prevalent in our market. And 2 or 3 years ago, we weren't really coming across it. It was a little bit more niche, and buyers were not educated at all. So a bit more of a difficult proposition to sell. But as that experience is building, on our side and generally, sort of the market understanding what this is, it's becoming a lot more commonplace and more successful as well.
Yeah. You kind of alluded to it there, but what are your experience with it over this kind of time when it's an emerging thing? What are your experience with it so far?
Well, I think like anything, people just want to understand what the risks are. I think it's easy to see the merits, and the primary advantage, aside from all the financial elements which are obviously appealing, primary advantage is buyers get to choose exactly what what's going into their house. Like with any planning permission, the external elements are somewhat fixed, but the fit out and the design, all the things that people really care about, how they're going to use the house, they control. And I would say 90% of people who buy second-hand homes or often new build homes, they're not entirely satisfied with everything, and there are always changes they want to make. So this is an opportunity to do something which means you don't have to make any changes. So the appeal has always been there. The risk element is the thing which people have needed educating on, and what risks are there, how they're mitigated, and lots of at the beginning, we were obviously understanding what people's concerns were and trying to mitigate them on a sort of ad hoc basis. But since then, we've put together guides which are really helpful, and they explain that the investment that you make through the project is always trailing the value of the build. So you pay for things retrospectively. You don't overpay for the plot of land, therefore you've got that value that's protected. And then as the house is built, the walls are up, the roof's on, then you pay for that, and your value, the asset is worth as much or more than what you've invested to date. That's the principle, and that's the financial assurance that people really need to get their head around, I think. And also financial circumstances dictate to a large degree who can buy in this way. It does require a certain amount of equity.
So just to pick up on that point, actually, how have you seen buyers finance these types of purchases?
In various ways. Some of them are cashed if they're lucky enough, and more often than not, they'll have a good amount of equity, and they'll either fund it by releasing some equity from the existing house to fund the entire build, or release equity or have some amount of savings to buy the plot. and then fund the remaining balance through a self-build mortgage, which is a product that's existed for a long time, readily available in the market. And they, as part of the process, the lender, effectively, it's another, sort of safeguarding tool for a buyer to have that lender involved. They're going to send their own surveyors. They're going to see the progress on site. They're going to make sure it's financially viable. So, either cash or using a self-build mortgage, but both work really well. It's not, raising the finance isn't prohibitive, provided you've got enough equity to fund the plot purchase. That's the element which is difficult for some people, of course, because not everyone's got 30, 40, 50% cash or equity available to buy that piece of land.
For fear of repeating yourself, could you just speak more specifically about the kind of challenges that you've come across with custom builds?
Well, I think for some people, the idea is really appealing, but perhaps their financial situation doesn't allow for it. So that's obviously going to rule out some of the market. Although there are lots of creative ways of financing things and refinancing existing assets and so on. But fundamentally, there's got to be a certain amount of equity in what they own to fund that land purchase. So that's the first sort of major obstacle. In terms of attracting buyers, I think the same obstacles that apply for any early stage sale, so custom build, self-build, or even off-plan, engaging buyers at that stage. So some will want to move, most people in the market will want to move within 3 to 6 months. In these cases, it's going to be longer than that. It's going to be sort of 9 to 12, in some cases longer. So it won't suit everyone's sort of time frame. But for those people who are prepared to wait, the key thing is making sure they get the vision and lots of really high quality marketing, CGI imagery, fly-throughs, and getting a really clear picture together of what the house is going to look like, what the streetscape is going to look like, what the view from the bedroom windows is going to be. I think those are all really critical at that first stage when you're just trying to get some interest. And then what follows is the intricacies around financing and the process and timescales. So those are the obstacles, some of which apply to every sale, and some of them are specific to this particular process.
And finally, maybe a question for both of you. Do you think that the use of custom build requirements as a part of the planning approval process can actually make a difference in the government meeting their target of significantly increasing the volume of custom builds? Sam, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I think there's clearly an appetite for it. And it doesn't, I think that given that planners are more willing, there's a presumption that a site will get a permission even if there's some other elements that don't quite work. They're more willing to grant the permission. That means that these lots of these developments are not coming instead of another type of development. They're adding to that delivery of housing. So that's one element which just suggests that it's only going to help. In terms of demand, the UK is still, this makes up a small fraction of the overall houses delivered and built. So, if you look at elsewhere, across Europe, there's so much more potential for us to grow this market. So, I think it can help, but I don't know if it's helping enormously at the moment, even though it's becoming more prominent. I think there's lots of potential for it to grow.
Yeah, I think so. I found a stat about in Germany, 55% of new homes are delivered by way of self or custom build, which is obviously dramatically higher than what we've got in this country at the moment. So it's obviously doable. And I think when it becomes more prevalent in people's minds and people are more used to sort of seeing this way of doing it, then I think it will continue to expand, because obviously with our issues around housing in in this country, and we just need to deliver more of it. Than any ways which assist with that are going to be a good thing.
David and Sam, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for listening to Legal Thinking, and thank you to our guests for joining us on today's podcast. If you want to find out more about the topic that was discussed today, make sure to have a look in the show notes where we'll have linked everything up.
And you can find all of the back episodes of Legal Thinking in your podcast provider of choice, and you can also subscribe and follow us on there too. And as always, make sure you leave us a 5-star review on a podcast provider of choice, as that helps other people find us. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening.